Well, welcome everyone. I'm Anadea Judith, and together with my co-host Michael Wayne, this is Voices for the Future, in which we interview people that we select from the things we read and people we meet and people we are recommended to, who are really speaking about something that is a way of forward thinking about our future and how to create a better future. And at a time right now when democracy is falling apart before our very eyes, when trust in democracy is at an all-time low, I couldn't think of a better guest to have than Richard Lang. I'll quickly read his bio, although I think you read it in the email. Richard Lang is Chairman and CEO of Democrasoft, a California software company focused on online voting and collaboration, with special emphasis on education and civic engagement. He's a pioneer in the technology industry, co-inventor of the world's first dual-deck VCR, how interesting, in the early 80s, and creator of burst technology in the 90s, which enabled video and audio on demand. He's been a guest on MSNBC, featured by Good Magazine, presented at the World Cultural Forum in China, in his seminal book, Virtual Country Strategy. Oh, I'm on a green screen here. Strategy for 21st Century Democracy introduces the Advisory Vote Initiative, which is what we're going to talk about today. And let's just start there. You make a statement, we're presented with an opportunity of historic proportion to upgrade our original vision of democracy to coincide with the way our country has grown and changed. And from democracy that was built on 13 colonies where people rode on horseback, I would say we're up for a change. So let's tell us about the change that you are building.
Well, thank you, Anadea and Michael, for having me on the show, first of all. And, I guess to start with, when we talk about change, so much has happened. You can imagine 240 years ago, the founding fathers and mothers could not have imagined where we would be today. Things like the internet, social networking, and whatnot. And, they did a pretty darn good job, really. But the way that our government was structured was limited by what was known at the time, the communications method in particular. So, if we fast forward 200, it'll be soon 250 years, long time, it's amazing. The system has worked pretty well up until somewhat recently. And what has caused it, a lot of the, if not most of the recent turmoil has been technology. And in particular, the internet, which, it's an odd juxtaposition here, because what I'm here to talk about is internet-based. The technology is an enabling feature, but it's not about technology. And unrestricted, no guardrail technology has produced the effects not only of social networking, but has broadened the borders so that now there are so many sources of information. And so many essentially silos of news that individuals join, that has created this tribal community, a collective community in the country, where we have what we're told are the blues and the reds, and we're told it's never going to end. And all of the forces that are not in favor of a stronger democracy manipulate these sources of information. And we all know this. I'm probably not saying anything that we don't already know. But the question becomes, how do you counter that? Right? What do we do? Right? So there's the thing that we mostly hear about are reform efforts. And reform efforts, of course, are designed to address things like gerrymandering, voter suppression. There's a list, and there are many, and there are hundreds of really great organizations and individuals that are working in the reform movement. But here's the problem, a big one that we face, is that the reform movement, generally speaking, is going to take the time it takes, but it's dependent upon getting buy-in from the very people who are benefiting from the broken system.
Mhm.
So, you get a lot of lip service, you get a lot of, tiny incremental steps. And meanwhile, Rome is burning. The
Yeah.
planet is on fire, literally. And
Mhm.
so, what are we going to do about that? So, advisory voting takes on two or three important aspects, and it provides what we refer to as a bypass strategy. It's one that does not require buy-in from any elected representatives. It requires no laws to be changed, no constitutional conventions, and it's essentially a very, very simple concept. Right? The concept is, well, let me give you just some added context.
Yeah. So tell us
The
what it is.
yeah, so I'm saving it because context is so important. Usually when you introduce a new idea, as humans, we already have like ideas in our head, and we hear some words, and we think, oh, that's that, or
Yeah.
oh, that's this.
Mm.
And what I'm going to try and do today is approach this the way that in that parable that we all know about the blind men trying to decide what an elephant is. Okay, I'm going to try and approach this from multiple angles so that it makes sense. Okay, so the first one is in an environment that has produced complete tribalism and division, and people who don't even get along with their neighbors. What do we have in common? Right? What do we have in common? Where do we start? Is there anything we have in common where we can start? And there's one thing that we all have in common, and that is those of us that vote are registered voters. Okay, we are all registered voters. Now, why is that important? We're registered voters. Okay, that means the election comes, we can go vote. But this is not about voting in elections. Advisory voting is about utilizing the internet as an enabling technology to give a new power to registered voters, all registered voters. And that power is to be able to weigh in, to express our individual voices and thus a collective voice on issues, the issues that affect us every day, and to be able to do that every day, not once every 2 years or once every 4 years, because we all know what happens, the election cycle. I mean, the general election had barely been over, and already the talk started about the midterms and what's going to happen in the midterms, and everybody's focused on the next election. Meanwhile, people have opinions, we have views, we have voices, and we don't have a place to exercise that voice. So the advisory voter initiative essentially says, look, as registered voters, we can empower ourselves, and which is what the initiative part is about. So, we hopefully you'll ask me and we'll talk about where we're at in that initiative. But then essentially it means that as voters, we can count ourselves. We can present ourselves as a community of registered voters, which we can choose the things that we want to be heard on. And then we can weigh in from the convenience of the sofa with the voting booth in the palm of our hand, not have to get a ride to the polling place, not have to, get time off of work. And we can weigh in and be heard cumulatively as well as individually on all kinds of issues that matter to us. And the ability to do that is going to be fundamental, we believe, those of us involved with this, to being able to address our challenges nationally and globally. Because there comes the point where it doesn't matter who we've elected, they need guidance. They need to, there needs to be a voice that keeps the guardrails in place, that says, yeah, it doesn't matter what you heard in that poll that was put out by some special interest. Here's the actual vote of all the registered voters that are interested in this particular topic and are participating. So advisory voting, a new capability for registered voters, and that mechanism is what the initiative is about, and we're setting that up.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's I mean, that's great. It's brilliant, Richard. And as you all we really, after you're talking about the election like 2020 and 2022, and it becomes a media circus, but people, me, you, and a day, everyone, the only time we feel like we have our voice heard when we read or asked by a Gallup poll or one of the polls, and
Yeah.
57% of the people support this or this or this. But that has no bearing, and that's these random samplings of 1,000 voters, just a small amount. So what you're talking about is every person having the ability to register their vote in a way. I mean, an advisory vote, right, is true.
It's a real vote, and see that's important because it's not unlike a poll, like you just mentioned, which is essentially an extrapolation of 1,000 people, but it's not a vote. It's not a vote. Advisory voting are actual votes, and they are as secure. They will be as secure as online banking. You know, the financial system that the world runs on happens online. So that level of security can also be applied as one of our newest partner actually can provide us with that banking level security.
So
for advisory
a
voting.
bunch of questions coming in already, but let's just make it real clear to people. So
Yes.
how does it work? What's the mechanism? How do we get connected? How do the bills or the issues get presented? How do people participate? How does it work so people can get an idea what it is?
Okay, yeah, great point. So since it's not up and running yet, I'm going to ask you all to imagine, right? Imagine you're a registered voter and you've just heard in a news conference or on cable news or someplace, hey, there's a new capability now available. Every registered voter has an advisory voting account waiting for them. All they have to do is claim it. Just go to the website, claim it.
I did it today.
You have it immediately.
You're registered today.
Exactly. So once you've done that, and all of this, by the way, will be overseen by a public trust. But to come back to your question, you open your app and you'll see whatever the top issue is that all registered voters who are participating have determined is the next thing that we want to vote on, the topic that's up. It could be, you know, if it were today, it might be about vaccinations or masks or, you know, truckers, or, you know, who knows what. But there's at least one vote that's live where you can log in. It'll all be on one page, and you'll see a video, an educational video will be provided for you. Just like if you go into a traditional voting booth, you don't have videos, but you typically have like a recap of what the issue is about. You'll have a short video. Exactly. You have a short video. You may have a choice of a 1 minute, a 3 minute, or a 10-minute video, depending on how much time you want to invest. But the videos will be there, and the educational information about the issue you're voting on will have been vetted by top universities in this country. And so you'll know that what you're seeing and hearing is factual. And by the way, just as a footnote, that type of media we think of as civic media, a new type of media, one that's, it's not there to sell ads, it's there to educate, and that's it. So you'll see the video. There'll be other information if you want to click on a link or two to see who else is in support or against, if it's a yes, no, although that's not the only format. And then you'll be able to cast your advisory vote, and you'll look at the palm of your hand, and you'll decide either it's a multiple choice, or it's a agree or a disagree, or maybe it's a ranking, a prioritization of, here's 12 ways that we spend money, tax dollars, drag and drop them into the order you think makes the most sense today. All right, as an example. So after you've done that, you'll immediately see, okay, well, here are how many people are participating, and here's the breakdown on how people are voting. Now, what's very important to note is that in advisory voting, no data will be collected, none. So the only data will be authentication, right? So you log in, it's really you, and then your vote.
Same way with the bank account. For your only you can get into your bank account.
Only you can get it. And then finally your zip code. And why is that important? Because we want to know where people are that are participating, but we don't need to know what party they're in. We don't need to know their sex. We know they're 18 years old because they're a registered voter. But all of the other descriptors that cause people today everywhere to go, he's the enemy, she's the enemy, that's not my tribe. You wouldn't know what tribe, because you're not there to have a debate. You're only there to hear about a particular issue and vote on that issue, and there would typically be windows for voting. So like the voting window for a particular topic might be 3 weeks. It depends on the topic, and there will always be a little box in the bottom that says, what should we vote on next, so that voters themselves can decide what's important.
Oh, I see.
Now,
So you might list 6 issues, climate change, or
I mean, there may be suggestions of 100 issues, but they'll be ranked in order of popularity, and whatever's at the top, that's what's going to get voted on next. And so, those are kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I'm trying to answer your questions so people can sort of envision what happens.
Yeah.
So once
what keeps those videos from being biased? I mean, you can present information one way and you can present the same information another way and give a completely different, I mean, look at, Fox News' MSNBC,
Sure. Well, it'll be a combination of several things. The first one is transparency, because, ultimately it does come down to trust. I mean, and even though there's a technological component here, our focus in terms of those of us who are involved in the initiative has been on gathering leadership that transcends political definitions, that people who are deemed trustworthy, people of integrity, institutions of integrity. And I'll give you an example. PBS is currently the most trusted institution in this country. Something like 85% of Americans consider it the most trustworthy institution. So there are institutions that are seen that way. To your point, there's never going to be a time when 100% of the people look at a video and go, oh yeah, I trust that. I trust this. There's going to be, I don't know, maybe it's 20% of individuals who will be the last people on board. It's like, I don't trust anything except QAnon. Okay, but that's not the target for this. This is what our friend Steve calls the same center. These are when you take away the labels of liberal or conservative or progressive or Democrat or Republican or Trumpian, or take your pick, and all you're left with is, here's the issue today. You're a registered voter, so am I. We both get to come and learn about that issue and cast our vote. So, do we trust that the educational material is trustworthy? Hopefully, yes, because the names associated with it, the educational institutions, the public institutions who will be putting their names on this, it's their stamp of approval, and it's not going to be, some questionable thing that no one's ever heard of. And transparency, the process by which information is vetted will all be transparent.
Yeah.
You'll be able to go, and the entire operation will be overseen according to a published mission statement and operating principles. That's part of the transparency. So for instance, an operating principle is we don't collect data, demographic information. Okay. That's an operating principle. If a copycat were to not do that, were to ask people, are you a Democrat or Republican or whatnot, then it wouldn't be this. It would be something else. But the advisory vote initiative is intended to be pure and the simplicity of it helps that take place.
So Richard, I want to ask you, because it makes me think of states like California, Massachusetts, and others that have the citizen initiatives where enough signatures on a petition, and then that a referendum of citizens will vote, and if enough citizens vote yes, it becomes law. So what happens is, as I know, like California's classic, if it's something up for possible approval, voter approval, that will go against corporate interests, there's a lot of money that gets pumped into the state through media and voter misinformation to get people to vote against it. So how will voter advisory block that, so the corporations don't come in and convince people not to even a vote advisory, to not vote for something that will go against their interests?
Well, okay, so there's a few aspects to that question. So first of all, I want to draw a distinction between referendum and direct democracy and advisory voting. All right, what you're describing as a referendum is a type of direct democracy, but what makes it such, and what referendums have in common with that, is that they're binding. The results of that vote are binding. So, the corporations you're referring to, or the interests that have a dog in the race one way or the other, have less incentive when the results of the vote are not binding. Okay, for starters, and there is a point for sure where when enough voters are participating and those interests look at it and go, oh my God, 150 million people are saying, this is how they feel about fracking, for instance, or whatnot, right? That's a great sign. If we get to the point where we have the forces that have kind of corrupted our current democracy turning to advisory voting as their next target, it's already a success. But the thing to keep in mind is that it's not even about how people vote. Okay? It's not about an individual issue. It's about giving a voice, a vote and a voice to registered voters that do not have that voice currently. We have it in real elections, but those elections, all of the institutions that give people confidence in democracy are under attack. So it's a chance for a fresh start, because we can say, okay, even if it takes another 8 years to, clear the decks of all of the threats to democracy, on the side, in parallel, we would be building a mechanism and populating it with actual registered voters that say, here's how we feel about the issues. Even though it's not binding, you get to hear what we really think directly from us. And look at how people show up in the streets when there's, whether it's George Floyd, or maybe right now it's it's the truckers, we may or may not agree with them, but the point is they want to be heard. People want to be heard. They want to have the voice. They're willing to risk getting their heads beaten in with a baton or an AR-17 just to be heard. This is a lot safer. Oh yeah, you got an opinion? You don't have to go risk your life. You can just go online and be heard and be counted, not just heard, be counted. We've never counted ourselves before. I don't know if people realize that, but there's never been a national count on anything in this country.
Well, that's one of the purposes of demonstrations, like you say, is to show how many of us there are that believe in gay rights or believe in abortion or whatever the issue is. It's people show up in numbers because the numbers make a statement. So if this is non-binding, which I understand what you mean by that, then someone might say, well, if it's non-binding, why does it matter? And how do we know that an elected politician is going to respond? Because we know already, for instance, gun control, the majority of people want gun control and the politicians aren't doing anything about it. The majority of people believe in climate change and we're not doing something. So that's the thing I want to know.
Well, this brings us back to the zip code.
Yeah.
Okay. When we have a system that enables easily participation, civic engagement at scale, hundreds of millions of people, right? When we have that system in place, the numbers are there. The zip code allows every elected representative to see the writing on the wall before the next election. It's like, okay, I can see by zip code where the support is on this or on that. At the end of the day, I don't know that most politicians are strong enough to resist a real call to action in huge numbers from their voters, from their constituents. Right now, they tend to kind of slip out of responsibility because once we've cast our vote, we have to trust who we've elected for the next couple of years, and complain. But other than taking to the streets, there's no risk for them. There'll be a lot of risk for them now to ignore what their own constituents are saying, and to be able to see. And yes, it may be that that on any given issue, there are interests that want to sway public opinion. And so we're not trying to solve every problem. We can't prevent misinformation from being spread on social networks like Facebook. We're not trying to do that. What we are saying is there's going to be at least one protectable area where you can get factual information, and without having to argue with your neighbor, you can go in, learn about something, and have your voice heard. It's really that simple, and it's not like you have to get 100 million people to the polls. Everybody has a phone, pretty much, or access to the internet.
Yeah, we did have somebody who asked about what about people who don't have access to the internet? But in your book, you talk about how libraries and, but go ahead.
Well, it's already, there are places that barely have running water that have phones that have internet connectivity. So yeah, again, it's not, we can't let perfect be the enemy of good, and in this case, the enemy of great, because there's already north of 97% of people that have internet access, if you include libraries and schools. So,
which is far more than vote anyway.
Well, listen, if we got 90% of the registered voters to show up and vote, that would be an all-time record, even on a non-binding vote. And make no mistake, that will not be missed by mainstream and all media. I mean, imagine, 150 million people, more people that voted in the last general election show up to be heard about a topic that's in the news that's affecting them. So, and there are many, many such topics.
Yeah. So speaking to that, Richard, when we were talking before we went live, I brought up the Build Back Better Act, and the public overwhelmingly supported it, wanted to see it happen. There wasn't much bad to it, but it got one person blocked it and killed it. So Joe Manchin. So do you think like if advisory voting was already happening, would that, you feel like, could have stopped Joe Manchin from voting against it, or would have pushed the groundswell of public support to make it happen, to get through the Senate?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the reason is because, again, what are the consequences for a Joe Manchin? And not to pick on Joe Manchin, but you brought him up, right? What are the consequences? The next election, he looks at his district, he goes, I'm in a safe district. I'm going to get reelected, especially if I, buck the Democrats. And okay, would it have made a difference if Joe Manchin looked at the map of advisory votes and he could see that were it not for gerrymandering or for voter suppression, that the actual vote count in his state is overwhelmingly in favor of Build Back Better, right? It's one thing if your frame of reference is, well, how is the district drawn? Can I win? But when everyone everywhere can look at the map and say, hey, Joe Manchin's state has 80% of his voters want Build Back Better because they're going to benefit from it. It's a poor state. There's lots of programs. They want it. I don't see how a Joe Manchin ignores that, and every cable news outlet and pundit in the country is going to be asking him the same question. Joe, we're not talking about a poll. We're talking about your voters are telling you this is what they want. It's going to be much more difficult for that type of politician to avoid being held accountable.
That will be a wonderful day.
Yeah. So you're already answering many of the questions that have come in about the influence of political parties. What I hear you saying is that it's sort of like an electronic voters pamphlet that, instead of once every 2 to 4 years, is there every day. And we kind of assume when we read our voters pamphlet and we read the pros and cons that at least it's factual information. And yet everybody will get leaflets in their mailbox from various parties, vote no on A, vote yes on A. But that the pamphlet is neutral. So your advisory voting is like a virtual voter pamphlet.
It's exactly right. And also keep in mind that it's a real-time vote. Okay?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, unlike all of the campaigning and marketing that goes into influencing people's vote on election day, right? Billions spent to get them to vote a particular way, usually for candidates, not for issues, but sometimes for issues. But this is different because, who could keep up? It's like the voice is being expressed in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Within a 3-week period or an ongoing period. Here is where voters stand, and here's how many of them share the view or care enough about an issue to be counted in a particular way. Well, that's hard to propagandize against. It's a real-time expression of how people are feeling. And yes, they see that electronic pamphlet, as you put it, they understand the vote, and they're not going to get a thing in the mail that's going to affect their advisory vote. It's not binding. Those, again, it's a different paradigm.
Yeah.
And that's usually the hardest thing to really land in terms of this this concept. Is any kind of paradigm shift, by definition, there's not a place for it yet. There's not a context. People aren't used to it. So we try and present it in different ways.
It's a way of knowing the will of the people at any given time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In a quantifiable manner, not as a poll extrapolation. Polls are not democracy.
No.
I mean, if polls were so reliable, then why would we even have an election? We just look at the poll numbers on November 4th or whatever and say, okay, that's who's ahead. We'll take him, or her. This is actual civic engagement and actual democracy for the 21st century. It's an upgrade.
And it's real time all the time. And when someone casts a vote, do they then see, do they see the numbers that, 40 million, 15 million people voted yes on this issue, or?
Yeah, they would know that before they vote, and they would know it after they vote.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it's kind of a transparent, it's like a barometer that's showing you where the voters stand. And it's also important to note that not everything is going to garner massive participation. So the participation levels are an indicator of how important issues are to people. And, we've gone through periods, now is not one of them, but we've gone through periods where complacency is the norm, where people go, well, things are going pretty good. I don't need to track too much stuff. But this is different. This allows an immediate response and a channel to do that isn't there today, but hopefully will be there, presumably will be there as this. I think, in my view, is that it's inevitable that this is going to happen. And the only thing that's not inevitable is whether it's going to be owned by we the people, or whether it's going to get co-opted along the way and turned into the next great monetization strategy for a social network, which hopefully it's not going to be the case. We think we have enough of a head start. But once it's established, you only need one way to count, one mechanism, trustworthy counting mechanism. We just want to be counted, voters. We want to be heard.
Yeah.
So it's a good point about not being co-opted by monetization interests. It really would need to become a public trust, part of the commons, like a digital commons.
That's exactly right.
Just like you talk about PBS is really part of the commons, the public trust.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. So there's a question from Anne. I mean, there's a bunch of questions which we'll go over. Question from Anne that I just to clarify for her and anyone else. And then I have a question also technical. So Anne's asking, is it an app on your phone? And then I'm curious, I assume that once a person votes for whatever issue, their advisory vote, then they can't vote again. It's not like Major League Baseball voting for all-stars where you vote unlimited.
Actually, not. Actually, you would be able to change your vote.
Change your vote, right? Oh, okay.
Change it, but you couldn't have two votes yes.
Right, correct. You
Okay.
can't vote twice, but you can change your vote because your vote might be based on a set of circumstances that changes. And then you go, oh, the world just learned X, Y, and Z,
Mhm.
and I'm changing my vote.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so it's important to do that.
And it's an app that you can have on your phone or vote for your computer.
Well, either one,
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
both.
Yeah, and Greg asked a really good question. How do you keep people engaged in this process over time? Do they check into the site every day? And some people do read the news and check in, and some people don't care, and some people are informed, and some people are not informed. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you have to look at it as a dynamic process, right? The level of engagement is going to be largely driven by the issues themselves.
yeah,
When when there's complacency, when things are going great, maybe you won't have such great engagement, or if you do have engagement, it'll be on topics or issues that have more of a long-term influence on the society. But then there'll be other ones like, oh, well, what do we do in Ukraine? Should we be, adding troops, or should we be doing something else? Those more timely, and especially if it hits people at home, whether it's economics or environmental, the engagement is going to be there, because we're not proposing any policies. We're simply creating a channel where every registered voter can weigh in on whatever issues call to them. So some issues, not so much, but the big issues where people really care, there'll be nothing standing in the way of a person who wants to express their opinion and the ability to do so in the palm of their hand. And that's it. No gerrymandering, no voter suppression.
yeah.
yeah, you're basically creating a national digital feedback system
Yeah,
that
yeah.
gives feedback as to where the will of the people is.
Yeah. And this
Exactly.
is being done in Taiwan already, with virtual Taiwan, and they have person Audrey Tang, who's the
Yeah.
Minister of Digital Democracy. So I mean, we already have a forerunner to it in the and this would be wonderful to make this happen here.
So there are differences. There are differences. You're absolutely correct. They are a forerunner. Theirs is more in the area of direct democracy.
Uh-huh.
Estonia is another example where the votes are binding, and that maybe one day that would happen here, but it can't happen fast enough here. We're not Taiwan or Estonia. We can't move that quickly.
Yeah, but just to start going in that direction. I mean, citizen engagement, and another question came to my mind with the voter advisory. Will people also be able to put in their thoughts and opinions? And if so, how do you protect against the trolling and vitriolic dialogue that you find on social media and in the public discourse in general?
The quick answer is no. They will not be. It's not a place to debate. Things evolve. This idea has evolved. When I wrote my book, Virtual Country, originally we envisioned that there would be like optional, back and forth conversation as part of a voting module. That page where you on your app where you go in and vote. But we ultimately recognize that that's not necessary, and if anything, it contains the seeds of its own destruction. I mean, as soon as you give people a chance to start arguing, then the point is lost. This is a counting mechanism. It's a vote. It's not a social network. It's not to convince your friends. People will still participate. They'll leave here and they'll go to Facebook or whatever is going at that time. And sure, that's always going to happen outside. This is simply the mouthpiece for we the people.
Well, in the same way the voting booth is, when you go to vote in your district, on voting day, you don't get into a debate with a person in the booth next to you. You just go and you say yes or no, But like you say, you're voting on people, you're not voting on issues. You're voting on people who you hope will represent your issues, but you have no say in issues. What you're talking about is this is voting on issues, not people.
Right. And you know, when you think about the challenges that we face nationally and globally, we have to have a way to weigh in. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, we can't just trust that, you know, there is no trust to begin with. But even if there was trust, don't we owe it to our elected representatives to at least be very clear about what we want? You know, I mean, it's a way of collectively voicing our intentions, our priorities. You know, the sentiments that we want our elected representatives to be aware of. Now they don't have that. You know, so this is ultimately in support of our elected representatives. It's not meant to crash their system. That system is, you know,
Crashing on its own.
it's crashing on its own. But
Yeah.
but this is a means of you know, firming it up,
Yeah.
of providing a foundation. It's giving cover. It's giving real cover to real public servants that can then say, hey, you know what? I was elected, and here are my voters, or here are the voters in my region, in my state, in my country, and I'm voting in accordance. They're very clear about what they want. I don't have to guess. I don't have to figure out which poll results I like the best and try and triangulate my position and hope that in 2 years I get reelected because I voted a particular way. All that goes away, you
Yeah.
know.
And
Yeah.
news media would have access to this too. And the news media can report that, 8 million people just voted yes on,
I suspect it'll be part of the reporting everywhere when the participation level gets over a certain point. I'm not sure how many that is. You know, again, when you have low levels, you can ignore it, but when you get high levels, it's a mandate, and no one can ignore that. No one
Yeah.
can ignore that.
Yeah. So Richard, this is great. This is awesome. So we're talking about the theoretical, and not more than theoretical, but the question is, what's the timeline for when we can start?
Well, there's different places to start. Okay, this initiative has started a number of years ago, and it has a life of its own. And organically, it is gaining momentum and it's growing. And our focus has been on assembling the leadership with integrity that ultimately will be responsible for running the public trust and for introducing it, et cetera. You know, timeline. There are things that people can do now, but they're preliminary. For instance, you could go to the website advisoryvote.us and pre-register for an advisory voting account. So what that means is that when it launches, you'll be notified, and you'll already be, you'll be amongst the first to be notified that, hey, it's gone live. When will it go live? There are moving parts, obviously, in our society, lots of them. One of them is the elections, the midterms, and then the general election. And so there will be windows where it makes the most sense to launch advisory voting. But before anything launches, we really want to have the people in place, because without the people, the likely outcome would be, oh, that must just be some other app, some startup somewhere, or, why should I pay attention to this over 100 other things where I could do something online? But our focus in the last several years has been on assembling the leadership that when it does go live, when it's ready to be introduced to the public, that it'll be impossible to ignore. It'll be impossible to miss. So when will that happen? Probably not any sooner than 18 months, and probably not any later than 4 years. So it depends on events in the world. It depends on the pace at which leadership continues to come on board. It'll depend upon levels of funding and what's required at various points.
Yeah. So how will this be paid for? How do you fund this kind of thing?
Well, initially, it has to be philanthropy. I mean, short of a GoFundMe to save our democracy, the quickest, we laugh, and yet, we've had different points in our discussions along the way where we thought about, maybe really what it takes is a kickstart democracy, effort. But fortunately, there is leadership in this country, that in the world of philanthropy, where not everybody's top goal is to shoot themselves to Mars. There are a lot of very wealthy people that are happy and willing to support efforts, especially right now with the state of our democracy. So we have made some pretty significant inroads in terms of those kinds of relationships. So initially philanthropy. The good news is something like this doesn't require $1 billion to start. It's relatively simple to operate, and it's not a social network. It requires a solid public trust that's well funded, and and everything associated with it. But ultimately, the sustainability it will be there without philanthropy, we believe. And the way that can happen, the way we think it'll happen, is by extending the capability for registered voters to cast advisory votes, extending it to regional and local, geographies,
Yes.
geographical areas. So, for
In
instance,
your own county.
in your own county, how about in your own city, right? Yeah. So, many years we lived in Sebastopol. Sebastopol might have an issue coming up on bike paths, and they want to ask, 10,000 residents, how do you feel about these bike paths? So the town council, for instance, in Sebastopol, or any city, would be able to purchase from the public trust the ability to put topics in front of voters on a per issue basis. So for instance, a city that's the size of Sebastopol, maybe it would cost the town council, I don't know, 5 cents a voter to put something in front of them. So maybe they spend $5,000 or some amount of money, but that money goes upstream to the public trust. And for instance, look at mayors. There's just under 20,000 mayors in the United States. Mayors are where they really interact with the voters locally. I mean, that unlike the U.S. Congress, they face the constituents every day. And so, the ability of even half of those mayors utilizing advisory voting on an even semi-regular basis to elicit feedback from their community, that's a lot of money when you add it up, flowing into the public trust to support the larger organization and the national voting. We would never, voters themselves would never have to pay, but an individual community will have a budget to the same budget that right now they would use for a public opinion poll. For probably half of that, they can actually have a vote, an advisory vote in their community.
So what if, the oil industry, which has a lot of money, wanted to put out something, and to influence, and they have more money than the solar industry, for example. And the solar industry also wants to put out a bill. How does that work? Does that put money back in politics?
I'm not sure I'm tracking your question. So when you say put out a bill,
well, someone who has a lot of money would be more able to say, okay, I'm going to bring up the issue of bike paths or solar roofs or whatever. And if they have a lot of money in it, in fact, this is happening in California right now, they want to put a tax on all solar because the, PG&E and whatnot, those industries don't want people going solar. They're losing money. So they're trying to put a tax on it all. So to keep the moneyed interests from dominating, they can afford to put this issue up, this other issue, these people can't afford to. You know what I mean?
They wouldn't, I think I do. And they would not be the ones putting an issue up for a vote.
I see.
That would be strictly the registered voters themselves.
Okay.
The registered voters decide what to vote on next. Now, at a local level, you might have a town council or a mayor
Yeah.
that wants to get that real-time feedback from the community. But you would never have a corporation that is in a position to put a vote in front of advisory voters.
Okay.
It's what we call, like, it's a vertically integrated system, advisory voting. So it's the same mission statement, same operating principles, the same kind of process, and the very same voting account. Right. So if you end up, say you start at the national level and you open an advisory voting account, well, that same account will enable you to vote at the state level if there's a state issue. If the governor puts an issue in front of California voters, where the same voting account will work in your local town. And conversely, the first time you hear about advisory voting might be because your city just told you, hey, we're inviting you to be an advisory voter. Here, come and claim your advisory voting account. Well, guess what? Once you do that, once you've authenticated yourself as a registered voter, that same advisory voting account will now work on any vote, statewide, regionally, or nationally. You don't have to open a different account every time. That's like your passport to vote. You get to use it at whatever level you want to use it. And,
So have you had any politicians come out and say, well, this is great? Not that they're saying we're going to pass and do anything, but just to say, we support this.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have one politician who's the mayor of Fort Collins in Colorado, who is one of our advisors, who was just recently elected there, and who plans, or so she tells us, she plans on being one of the very first communities to implement advisory voting in Fort Collins.
That's
so,
cool.
And we've had indications from others. And most of the people who are elected to office right now, as you might expect, they're like, yeah, we like the idea. Let us know when you're ready to go live. Now, some of them, like Jenny Arndt, were more interested than that. They were like, yeah, I'd like to be one of your advisors and help you kind of figure out what's the best strategy for instance, addressing mayors across the country. The mayor strategy is a big part of our rollout, because they're, that's a lot of people when you start adding up all those communities.
Well, it seemed it would make sense to start with the cities and the counties and the states. And, even if you got it all going in one state, like Colorado or something, and you could demonstrate how this works, and the politicians there at the state level would really have an experience of this, that would be a model that then encourages other states to get on board.
Yeah, and I think that's correct, and I think it'll go in both directions. I think it will go kind of local up and national down at the same time.
That's great. This is an incredible vision, and what a monumental task to take on, to coordinate and implement that. Only imagine the building blocks and the hurdles and all of that, the scale. But it's a really, when you hear about it, when I first heard about it years ago, it was like, of course, this makes obvious sense. It's like one of those things that you didn't think of, but once you thought of it, you go, why didn't I? It seems so obvious.
Well, and also, let's keep in mind how long it took just to establish democracy in this country, just as one example. It isn't something that happened in a 2-year period or 4-year period. It was literally decades in the making. And before we're done, I wanted to read you a quote. In a couple of days, it's Abraham Lincoln's birthday.
Oh, yeah.
And when I was writing my book, I found a quote that's so appropriate, and I just want to read it to you. It's very short. Abraham Lincoln said, "What I want is to get done what the people desire to have done. And the question for me is how to find that out exactly."
Oh.
Yeah.
How to find that out. We're answering that call. This is how to find out.
That's right.
I
highlighted the same quote in your book to bring it up. Yeah, so I'm glad you did. Yeah.
This is really an idea. It's revolutionary, radical, an idea as time has come, and it's something that through the groundswell of advisory voting can put people like Mitch McConnell, who I doubt will ever say that what a great idea this is, and actually just, not silence him, but just neutralize him to some degree. I mean,
Again, it's a bypass strategy. It's,
Yeah,
let
bypass.
Washington do what they do. Meanwhile, we the people, registered voters, can unite and say, okay, as a group, we do have the power, but only if we express our voice. And the fact that we've not been able to do it in the past is the reason that we have the problems we have today. By creating the avenues, the channel by which to express that collective and individual voice, that changes everything.
Mm-hmm. Do you have time to stay on for a few questions?
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
Yeah. Greg asks, once an issue has been voted on, what happens with the results? Are they saved? Are they promoted?
They're archived, and that's assuming that an issue may have to be closed at some point simply because it's been resolved. Should a bridge go up? Should a dam go in? At some point a decision is made and it's no longer a relevant topic. Other issues will stay open, some for a few weeks, some indefinitely, but the results will always be archived. So even though there'll always, for the most part, be maybe one or maybe two issues that are in front of the voters for a somewhat of an extended period of time, they won't disappear after a vote has been taken. They'll be archived. The thing we want to avoid is having 100 issues up at the same time. Where there was the group in San Francisco who tried something. They were funded by Facebook a few years ago, and they basically were DOA primarily because, two reasons. One, they were all about monetizing the voters. I think voters are smarter than that. And number two is because right out of the box, there were 100 topics to weigh in on. Like, who's got time? And then to make matters worse, it was, well, convince your friends on social media to come and join your position. And the whole thing was just like, so diluted that there was never going to be impact. The thing about advisory voting is that it's rarely a simple idea, and it's concentrating all of us in one place, on one issue at a time, without the distractions that are normally associated with demographics and debate.
And what I love about it is, I've always said, democracy isn't the will of the people when it's only every 2 to 4 years. This is an ongoing participation. That's what I love about it. Yeah. Do you have questions that have come in that I haven't seen, Michael?
No, everything's in the chat box.
Yeah, Susan asked, have you contacted the CCL, which is Citizens Climate Lobby, to join you?
We have not at this point. If that's someone you think we should be contacting, you can, anyone who's listening can reach us at info@virtualcountry.us. And we'll get your emails for any kind of suggestions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you typing that in, Michael? Info? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Great. And we can also open it up. Can people only ask questions on the chat, or we've had voice questions before, right?
I think we can. If someone wants to ask, they would raise their hand. I think somewhere. Raise your hand. Yeah, raise hand. It would show up in the participants box. So Richard, you also talk about, and it's townsquare.us, but talk about the concept of town square.
Yeah. Virtual town square. Yeah.
Virtual town square.
Yeah. So a little bit of history. So the branding, the messaging has evolved as the initiative has evolved. 4 years ago, when my book Virtual Country was published, the frame that we presented was National Town Square, a place online where advisory voting takes place. And that actually served its purposes quite well, in the sense that, the words town square, people already have a slot for that somewhere in their brains. When you say it, Facebook claimed to be the big town square. And so, but that wasn't the innovation. The innovation was advisory voting. And so the book is all about advisory voting, but the National Town Square verbiage we've dropped as of about 6 months ago. And when we made the shift to advisory voting, there was a monumental increase in understanding and in support from
Yeah.
the people we were talking to. So, that was, part of our learning, and again, it's an organic process, and it has somewhat of a life of its own. So, I think those of us who are working on this consider ourselves stewards of it, as opposed to, entrepreneurs per se. We're entrusted with delivering this idea to where it's functional and it's got integrity and trustworthiness.
Yeah, and Richard, it's like bringing up Facebook and contrasting with what you're doing really helps people understand what Facebook is not a public trust. When it first started, it was like everybody thought, oh, this is so great. We can communicate, we can connect, but the monetization demons came in so quickly to take away the ability for people to connect. And that's, it's poison now. So,
well, and it's funny, it's so in a sense decentralized that there ceases to be an organizing principle in terms of values, right? I mean, perfect example. If you look at the impact on our elections, it's now, well, in 2020, in 2016, even 64% of the voters got their main news from Facebook. And Facebook, as we've now learned since 2016, is just like a breeding ground for misinformation. And it's actually worse than that. It's a delivery mechanism. It's a distribution mechanism. So, nefarious parties from anywhere in the world can influence our elections. And it's probably somebody in the audience is thinking, well, couldn't they influence advisory voting? And of course, that's always going to be, people are always going to be subject to influence from outside of advisory voting. They'll have to make their own decisions about who they trust or whatnot. But when it comes to the actual, very simple mission, which is here's vetted factual information and here's your ability to be counted, that's protectable. That's protectable space. And that's, part of keeping it simple is what makes that protectable.
Yeah, because it seems the biggest issue would be that it not be corrupted.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's nothing to corrupt. It's not like, with Facebook, there are literally billions of points at which it can be corrected. Every single person is a data point. Every single person is where a bad link can get in, is where misinformation can flow through the system. That's impossible. What we have with advisory voting, it would be a walled garden for integrity. It's very simple. It's just you go there to learn and be counted. One thing, no debate, so it's not a social network. It's the opposite of a social network. It's a place for civic media and being counted.
Mm-hmm. Do you use a kind of blockchain technology to keep everybody's account single?
Actually, blockchain is something that will probably have a role in the way that it operates. It's from the transparency standpoint. I mean, blockchain is one of the lesser understood developments in technology, and it can be used for good and for bad.
Yeah, and it's high energy usage also.
Yeah. But with regard to advisory voting, it will probably be a way to transparently verify that the process is working as advertised, that it's not being corrupted. Because again, there are very few things to track.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but Joanna asked a question that I think you just answered in talking about this. She asked, will this be of detriment and emotional reaction to issues? So that's what you were saying, that be able to block out that ability for people to throw up misinformation and get people riled up.
Yeah, well, it won't be happening. Misinformation and getting people riled up will not be happening within the advisory voting booth, in the palm of your hand, in that app, on that website. Will never happen there. But again, we can't control what happens outside of there. We're just saying, like Amadeus said earlier, we're bringing the voting booth into your living room, onto your sofa, into your hand, and you get to be counted like you would be if you went to a physical voting booth, but in between elections.
Yeah.
And not for candidates.
And when you're actually behind the curtain voting, you have a pure space there that nobody's influencing you. When you walk out into the parking lot, you may run into people with picket signs.
Well, and in all fairness, people may still be in, it's never going to be a homogenous kind of, set of voters. I mean, you're going to have people who have been influenced one way or another on all kinds of issues. Our goal with the initiative is not to steer people into a political position. It's to give every single registered voter their own voice and collectively enable we the people to be heard on a daily basis. And in doing so, guide our politicians with like verifiably countable
beautiful.
Sentiment.
Beautiful. Yeah, wonderful.
So if people want to sign up, they just go to the website, Advisory Vote, right?
Advisoryvote.us. You can pre-register, and for sure, if it's something that calls to you, you can certainly share it with your friends. I mean, there's nothing wrong with using social media to direct people to the website. These two are separate items. I mean, even when advisory voting is up and running, the actual voting module, like that page where people would participate, will have its own unique URL. So it can be passed around. I mean, it could go viral on TikTok or on Facebook, but it won't be impacted by Facebook activity. It will simply be a thing that you still have to log into. You still have to be registered voter. It's still your private account. It's just that you may not have known that there was such a thing until you heard about it from your friends on Facebook, and you go, "Oh, great, yeah, man, claim my account."
Yeah.
And from now on, I get to weigh in.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is an exciting idea. I really would want the wind in your sails and Providence to work with you, because this is a huge undertaking and a monumental change and a beautiful vision that you have.
Yeah. How long?
Thank you.
This, Richard?
How long?
Yeah.
Well, the seeds of it, the first seeds were in the early 80s. It kind of took real form in the mid 90s, and about 10 years ago, well, actually in 2010, when the company that I started, Democrasoft, before it got focused on education, we built a platform that could actually provide advisory voting. But because we were a private company, we had to go where the market was, and the market was education at that point. That's everybody who signed up were teachers. So we ended up redirecting the company towards education, eventually having more than 74,000 educators and their students around the world utilizing our collaborized classroom is what it was called. But that was a time from 2010 until recently that we were able to establish that the mechanism would work, that the technology was not a problem. And so having done that, we already sort of beta tested the essential technology. And recently we added a pretty great partner that we're, I guess, now allowed to share that in principle, a company called Smartmatic, who is, they're a global company, and they actually run digital voting in a number of places around the world. Their claim to fame, other than suing Rudy Giuliani and a bunch of others for libeling them, accusing their machines of cheating. Aside from that, their claim to fame is that they've conducted over 5 billion individual digital votes without even one single instance of compromise, where a vote has been compromised or hacked.
Wow.
And they have agreed to create and support the underlying technology platform for advisory voting. It's a huge thing, a huge partner.
Wonderful.
So that's recent. That's a recent development.
Oh, that's the right partner to have.
Yeah,
it's a good one. It's a good one. And I think we'll end up with other great partners. These things, I think, in a sense, the worse things get in the current political situation, the more open individuals and companies are to, we need another strategy, because the one we're using doesn't work. And even if the current, in a worst case scenario, even if things continue to go downhill for a few years in the traditional system, as long as the advisory voting initiative is gaining momentum, once we launch, that will rebalance our system, because that will give back what's been taken away in, when the trust is gone, when institutions are compromised. This is a way to come back.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time today, Richard. This is Richard Lang, and you can go to advisoryvoting.us, right?
No, advisory vote.
Advisoryvote.us, and it's written in the chat.
The link's in the chat, so you just click on the link. You'll go right to it.
Yeah.
This is great. So somewhere between 18 months and 4 years is what you're saying? You hope you have it? Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Anadea. Thank you, Michael. And thank you all of you who are tuning in to watch. Appreciate your interest.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks so
Rick.
much.
Yeah.
All right.
Peace.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.